Amara was a young woman, raised in a respected family in a quiet village. She had been brought up with the kind of values that many dreamed of, but few truly experienced. Her family had always been at the center of the village, a symbol of tradition, success, and wealth. From a young age, Amara was taught the importance of family reputation, the responsibilities of being a part of such a well-regarded lineage, and the pressure to uphold their honor. She was always aware that her future would be shaped by these expectations. As a child, Amara dreamed of a fairy tale marriage, one where love would conquer all, where her Prince Charming would sweep her off her feet, and together they would create a life full of happiness and warmth. But as she grew older, reality set in. The love she imagined seemed more like a distant fantasy than a possibility. Her family had different ideas, particularly her mother, who believed that marriage was more about social standing than emotions. She often reminded Amara that love was something that could grow over time, but the right match was paramount for their family's future. Amara's world was one of perfect appearances, and she was expected to keep up with this image. The pressure was overwhelming, but she tried not to let it get to her. She tried to convince herself that marrying someone well off and highly regarded in society would be enough. Love, after all, would follow, wouldn't it? And so, Amara agreed to marry Jomo, a man who seemed like the perfect choice. He was well educated, charming, and came from a respectable family in the city. He had all the right qualities on paper: an impressive job, a strong family background, and a future that would complement hers. The village buzzed with excitement at the announcement of their engagement, and Amara's mother beamed with pride, convinced that this union would strengthen their family's reputation. The wedding was nothing short of a grand affair. The entire village attended, and Amara was the center of attention. She smiled through the ceremony, her heart full of duty, not love. She had learned to suppress the doubts creeping into her mind. This was her destiny, and she had no choice but to fulfill it. Jomo, standing next to her, seemed calm and composed, his smile radiant. But behind his eyes, Amara couldn't help but sense something distant, something missing. Still, she convinced herself it was normal. After all, marriage was not just about love, but about building a life together, about security and stability. But as the days passed, Amara began to feel the weight of her decision. Jomo, though respectful and kind, seemed to lack the emotional connection she had longed for. The late nights at the office, the distance between them during their conversations, the absence of affection, it all started to weigh on her heart. Yet she brushed it aside. It was just the beginning after all. There would be time for their bond to grow, wouldn't there? But beneath the surface, there were subtle signs that everything wasn't as perfect as it seemed. The more Amara tried to convince herself that this marriage would eventually bring happiness, the more she found herself questioning whether it had all been a carefully constructed illusion. Amara's wedding day arrived like a dream, a picture-perfect celebration of tradition and grandeur. The sun shone brightly over the village, casting a warm glow on the grand hall where the ceremony was to take place. The air was thick with the fragrance of flowers, and the sounds of joyous laughter filled the atmosphere. Amara, dressed in an intricately embroidered gown, stood in the center of it all, surrounded by family, friends, and neighbors who had come to witness her union with Jomo. The ceremony was an elaborate affair, with music playing softly in the background and prayers being spoken over them by the village elders. Her mother, proud and tearful, watched as Amara exchanged vows with Jomo, the man her family had chosen for her. The village celebrated with enthusiasm, marveling at the lavish event. But as Amara stood at the altar, her heart wasn't filled with the fluttering excitement she had imagined. Instead, it was heavy with doubt. The vows, the promises, the exchange of rings, they all felt like an act she was performing rather than a moment of deep emotional connection. Jomo stood beside her, tall and composed, his face a mask of calm and confidence. His words during the ceremony were warm, his smile radiant, but there was a coldness in his eyes that Amara couldn't ignore. His touch was gentle, yet distant. There was no spark, no sense of excitement between them, only the mechanical motions of a day that was about appearances rather than emotions. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd erupted into applause, Amara forced a smile, her heart feeling like a heavy stone in her chest. This was what she had been raised for, wasn't it? To live up to expectations, to play the part of the perfect bride. The reception was no different. The laughter, the toasts, the well-wishes, they all blended together into a blur. As Amara sat with Jomo at their table, she tried to engage in conversation, but he was distracted, his attention on his phone or speaking briefly with other guests. There was no sense of connection between them, and Amara's heart ached with the realization that this was it. This was the man she had married, the man she was now bound to for life. As the honeymoon phase began, the distance between them only grew. The days that followed the wedding were filled with a sense of emptiness. Amara would wake up in the morning, expecting a kind word, a loving gesture, something to make her feel seen and valued. Instead, she was met with silence. Jomo would leave for work early in the morning, barely acknowledging her presence. When he did return home, he was often exhausted, preoccupied with work, or too caught up in his own world to notice her longing gaze. Amara, unsure of how to handle the growing emotional distance, began to question her own feelings. She had always known that her marriage would be one based on duty rather than love, but she never imagined it would be this cold, this devoid of warmth. The lack of affection, the absence of emotional connection, made her feel suffocated in the perfection that everyone around her seemed to admire. She began to wonder if this was how it was supposed to be. Was this normal? Was she simply expecting too much from a marriage that was, after all, more about societal expectations than personal happiness? She pushed these thoughts aside, telling herself that it was only a phase. After all, she had been raised to believe that love would come with time, that the foundation of a marriage was built on respect, not passion. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the facade of her marriage grew harder to ignore. Amara would attend social gatherings with Jomo, always standing by his side, smiling and greeting guests with grace. But inside, she felt empty. She felt like a prisoner in her own life, trapped in a role she hadn't chosen for herself. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, reminding her that this was the life she was supposed to have, a life of respect, stability, and social standing. But in her heart, Amara knew that this was not the life she had dreamed of. Jomo, meanwhile, seemed completely indifferent. His coldness only deepened with time. The gestures of love that she had once hoped for never came. She tried to fill the gaps in their relationship by focusing on her duties as a wife. She took care of the house, cooked his meals, and made sure everything appeared perfect on the outside. But no matter how much effort she put into being the perfect wife, she couldn't escape the nagging feeling that she was invisible to him. Her thoughts began to spiral, and she found herself questioning the decisions she had made. How had she gotten here? How had she allowed herself to become a part of something that felt so hollow? She felt trapped, unable to speak up, unable to share her feelings with anyone. She feared that if she opened up, she would only be met with disapproval or indifference. The pressure to maintain the perfect image of a marriage was suffocating, and Amara didn't know how to escape it. Amara's suspicions about Jomo began to grow, creeping into her thoughts like a shadow that refused to leave. At first, it was little things. His late nights at work, the way he always seemed to be in a rush when he left the house, and the way he would quickly hang up the phone whenever she entered the room. She tried to brush it off, telling herself that she was simply overthinking, that the stress of their new life was getting to her. But something inside her began to nag at her, a voice whispering that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't just the late nights or the phone calls. It was the way Jomo had become distant, almost invisible when he was home. He would come back from work, tired and irritable, and instead of engaging in any conversation, he would retreat into his world, closing himself off behind the walls he had built. Amara would try to ask about his day, his thoughts, anything to spark a connection, but he would brush her off with vague responses or dismissive remarks. "Busy day, don't worry about it," he'd say, and then go off to his study to work in silence. But it was the secretive phone calls that truly set her mind racing. He would often disappear into another room to take calls, his voice low and hushed, as if he didn't want her to hear. The one-sided conversations were all she could make out, but the tone of his voice was always different. Softer, almost tender. It struck her as odd. Why was he speaking to someone in such a warm, intimate way? She had never been given a reason to doubt his loyalty before, but now she found herself questioning everything. One evening, as Jomo was pacing around the living room, speaking softly on the phone with someone, Amara felt a familiar sense of unease wash over her. She had been sitting at the kitchen table, pretending to focus on a book, but her attention was entirely on the conversation unfolding in front of her. The phone call seemed to drag on forever, and the more she listened, the more her stomach twisted with anxiety. She caught a few words as Jomo turned his back toward her, but the tone in his voice was unmistakable. There was affection, familiarity, something she hadn't heard in his voice for a long time. When he hung up, she felt a rush of dread fill her chest. He walked into the kitchen, acting as if nothing had happened, but Amara couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The voice she had overheard on the phone was soft and sweet, but it wasn't hers. It wasn't the voice of the woman he had promised to cherish. The mystery woman had clearly meant something to him, something Amara hadn't seen in their marriage. That night, as she lay awake in bed, her thoughts ran wild. She tried to tell herself that she was imagining things, that she was just being paranoid. But as her mind replayed the conversation over and over again, she couldn't deny the truth she was starting to face. Jomo was hiding something far deeper than just work stress or long hours. There was another person, someone who mattered more to him than she ever had. The next day, Amara's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anger. She couldn't let this go. She had to know the truth. Her marriage, the life she had built, had always been about appearances, about playing the role she was expected to play. But now, she could no longer pretend that everything was fine. She had to dig deeper. Without Jomo knowing, Amara started her investigation. She began by checking his phone, a decision that made her stomach twist with guilt. She felt like a stranger in her own home, but her desire for answers overpowered her sense of right and wrong. The moment she unlocked his phone, she found messages that made her heart stop. There were texts, many of them exchanged at odd hours, each one seemingly harmless on the surface, but the tone was unmistakably flirtatious. The words they exchanged were filled with promises of longing, with phrases that didn't belong in the life of a married man. Amara felt like she had been punched in the gut. How had she missed all of this? How had she been so blind? She scrolled through his messages, each one like a sharp knife to her heart. He had been having an affair with someone she didn't know. She had no idea who this woman was, but it didn't matter. The realization was crushing. The man she had trusted, the man who had sworn to be her partner for life, had betrayed her in the worst way possible. But she wasn't finished. She needed to know everything. She checked his email, desperately hoping that there might be some clue, some evidence that would help her understand the extent of the betrayal. The more she dug, the more she uncovered. Secret meetings, hidden accounts, plans to meet in places she had never heard of. She felt like she was unraveling a life she didn't even know existed. Later that day, when Jomo returned home, Amara confronted him. Her heart raced, her hands shaking as she looked him in the eye. "Who is she?" she asked, her voice trembling but firm. Jomo's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. Instead, he stammered, trying to find an excuse, a lie, to cover up the truth. But Amara wasn't buying it. She had seen enough. She knew now that his silence spoke louder than any words could. Jomo tried to deny it, but the lies were transparent, and Amara wasn't willing to accept them anymore. The emotional turmoil she had been fighting for months was now clear as day, and she couldn't let it slide any longer. What started as a suspicion had turned into a painful truth. The man she had married, the man who was supposed to love her, had betrayed her in ways she never could have imagined. And now, Amara was faced with the cold reality of the marriage she had tried to convince herself was real. Amara felt as if the walls were closing in around her, her heart racing as she realized the depth of the betrayal. What had once been a perfect marriage, a union she thought was built on mutual respect and understanding, was nothing more than a carefully crafted illusion. The truth she had uncovered was far darker than she could have ever imagined. Jomo had been living a double life, one she never saw coming. The revelation hit her like a freight train. Jomo's affair wasn't with some stranger. It was with Zuri, her best friend. Zuri, the woman who had stood beside her on her wedding day, smiling with joy as Amara exchanged vows with the man she thought was her soulmate. Zuri, the one who had been there for Amara through every difficult moment, offering support and advice, now revealed as the very person who had conspired with Jomo to destroy everything she had ever believed in. Amara's mind raced with disbelief. How could Zuri do this to her? How could Jomo, the man she had trusted with her heart, do this to her? The discovery sent a surge of adrenaline through Amara's veins. She couldn't sit idly by any longer. It was time to confront both of them, to demand the truth, and to reclaim her dignity. Her hands shook with a mixture of fear and anger as she dialed Zuri's number, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Zuri, I need to see you. Now." When Zuri arrived, Amara's emotions were a storm of conflicting feelings: hurt, anger, betrayal. But there was also a strange sense of clarity. This was no longer about saving her marriage. It was about facing the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Amara didn't waste a moment. She turned to Zuri, her voice cold and accusing. "You've been with him, haven't you? All along." Zuri's face turned pale as the weight of the accusation hit her. She opened her mouth to deny it, but Amara's glare stopped her in her tracks. "Don't lie to me, Zuri. I know everything. You and Jomo, behind my back. How could you?" Her voice cracked as the anger rose, the betrayal sinking in deeper with every word. Zuri faltered, her eyes welling with tears, but there was no escape now. Amara had already uncovered the truth. Jomo had been having an affair with Zuri for months, ever since the early days of their marriage. Their secret rendezvous, their whispered phone calls, the stolen glances, they had all been part of a scheme that Amara had been blind to. Zuri had been her confidant, the one person she trusted above all others, and now, to her horror, she had become the very person who had shattered her world. Before Zuri could respond, Jomo walked into the room, his face pale and his body tense. He knew this moment was inevitable. Amara's gaze turned to him, burning with a mixture of heartbreak and fury. "You!" she spat, her voice trembling with anger. "You never loved me, did you?" Jomo didn't say a word at first, but the silence spoke volumes. The guilt, the shame, the confession, it all hung in the air like a heavy fog. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet, resigned. "No, Amara, I never loved you. I married you for your family's wealth, for your status, for the life you could offer me. I thought I could live with it, that it would be enough, but it never was." His eyes met hers, but there was no apology in them, only a cold truth that had been long buried. The words hit Amara like a slap to the face. She had always known there was something missing in their marriage, but to hear him admit it so bluntly, so cruelly, was a pain she had never anticipated. She had been nothing more than a pawn in a game that was never hers to play. Her marriage had been a means to an end for Jomo, a way for him to climb the social ladder, and her best friend Zuri had been his accomplice. It was all too much to bear. The room seemed to close in on Amara, the weight of the betrayal crushing her chest. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes, but she fought to hold them back. She wouldn't let them see her break. Not now. She turned to Zuri, her voice icy. "You were supposed to be my friend, my best friend. How could you do this to me?" Her words were like daggers cutting through the silence. Zuri's face crumpled, her tears falling freely now as she tried to explain, but the words seemed empty. She was just as guilty as Jomo, and Amara could no longer look at her the same way. "I'm sorry, Amara," Zuri whispered, her voice breaking, but the apology didn't matter. It couldn't erase the hurt. Amara didn't know what hurt more, the betrayal of her husband or the betrayal of her closest friend. Both had taken something precious from her, and in return, they had left her with nothing but shattered pieces of a life she once thought she understood. Without saying another word, Amara turned on her heel and walked away. She didn't need to hear their excuses or explanations. The truth was clear, and she no longer wanted to be a part of their lies. As she left the room, her heart felt as if it had been torn in two. But in the midst of the pain, there was also a sense of clarity, a glimmer of empowerment. She had faced the truth, and though it had broken her, it had also set her free. As Amara stood in the hallway, the tears finally fell, not in weakness, but in the release of everything she had held inside. Her marriage was a sham, and her world had been turned upside down. But one thing was certain: she would rebuild. She would find herself again, even if it meant walking away from everything she had once believed in. In the distance, Jomo and Zuri's voices faded, their words lost to the weight of Amara's newfound resolve. She had faced the hardest truth of her life, and now, the path ahead was hers to choose. After the heart-shattering confrontation with Jomo and Zuri, Amara felt as though the floor had been ripped from under her. The betrayal was overwhelming, a deep wound that pierced through every part of her being. But in the silence that followed, something changed within her. She realized that despite the pain, despite the humiliation, she had the power to change her own fate. No longer would she allow herself to be a victim of someone else's lies. No longer would she be a passive participant in her own destruction. The first step was clear. She had to leave. She couldn't stay in the house where the memories of her false marriage would haunt her at every turn. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating her. Amara packed her things in silence, her heart heavy, but her mind focused. She knew it wasn't going to be easy, but this was the moment that she had to take control. For the first time in her life, she would be the one to decide her future, not Jomo, not her family, not anyone else. When Amara finally walked out of the house, the weight of the years she had spent trying to please others seemed to lift from her shoulders. It wasn't easy to leave behind everything she had known, the family, the comfort, the security. But what awaited her on the other side was something far more important: herself. She had never been allowed to live for herself before, but now, in the face of everything she had endured, she realized that her happiness and well-being mattered more than anything else. The legal process of divorcing Jomo was long and grueling, but Amara was resolute. She was determined to remove herself from the charade of a marriage that had never been anything more than a transaction. Each step she took, from filing the papers to facing the inevitable confrontation in court, was a small victory for her. With each passing day, she felt more empowered, more in control of her life. It was as if a weight had been lifted, and the more she fought for her independence, the lighter she became. But even as she moved forward, the pain of betrayal still lingered. Her heart ached for what could have been, for the dreams of love and partnership that had been shattered in an instant. Yet, instead of letting this pain consume her, Amara found herself beginning to heal. She realized that her worth wasn't defined by Jomo or Zuri or anyone else's perception of her. she was more than the woman who had been wronged. She was a strong, independent individual who had the power to shape her own future. As part of her healing process, Amara made the decision to return to her childhood home, to the village where she had spent the first years of her life. The familiar sights and sounds of her old neighborhood were like a balm to her wounded soul. There, in the embrace of nature and the comforting presence of her mother, she began to reconnect with the parts of herself she had lost along the way. The village was simple, far removed from the life of wealth and status she had once known, but it was real. It was genuine. The people were kind, grounded, and offered Amara the support she so desperately needed. Her mother, who had always loved her unconditionally, became her anchor during this time of rebuilding. With her encouragement, Amara slowly started to see herself in a new light, not as the woman who had been deceived, but as the woman who had risen above it. During long walks through the fields, Amara would sit by the river that had always been a place of peace for her. The sound of the water rushing over the rocks, the rustling of the trees in the wind, and the warmth of the sun on her skin helped to ground her. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to just breathe, to let go of the weight of everything that had happened. There, by the river, she rediscovered a sense of calm that had eluded her for so long. The healing process wasn't linear, and there were days when the pain would resurface. But with every step, Amara became more and more aware of her own strength. She no longer felt defined by her past, by the broken marriage, or by the betrayal of her best friend. She was building a new life for herself, one that was hers to shape and define. Her mother, ever the pillar of strength, often reminded Amara of her worth. "You were never meant to be anyone's second choice, Amara," her mother would say, holding her hand gently. "You are worthy of love, respect, and happiness. Don't let anyone make you feel less than that." Amara took these words to heart. She had spent so much of her life trying to meet other people's expectations, her family's, society's, Jomo's. But now, for the first time, she realized that her only responsibility was to herself. She was enough, just as she was. As time went on, Amara's confidence began to grow. She started to trust herself again, to believe that she was capable of achieving the happiness and fulfillment she had once thought impossible. She began to focus on her passions, her dreams, and the things that truly brought her joy. Slowly, she began to rebuild her life, not from the pieces of her past, but from the strength and wisdom she had gained through her experience. The support of her mother and other close friends became vital in her journey to reclaim her independence. It was these people who reminded her of the woman she had always been beneath the hurt. They lifted her up when she couldn't stand on her own, and helped her see that this new chapter in her life was not just about healing, it was about growth, transformation, and reclaiming the woman she had once been. Amara's journey of empowerment wasn't about forgetting the past, but about using it to fuel her future. It was about recognizing that despite the pain she had endured, she was stronger and more resilient than ever before. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving. And as Amara stood in the middle of the village one quiet evening, the sun setting behind the trees, she realized something profound. She had become the woman she was always meant to be. The woman who would not be defined by the mistakes of others, but by her own strength, her own choices, and her own happiness. The journey had been long, but the woman she had become was worth every step. Jomo's downfall was swift and relentless. What he had believed to be a carefully constructed facade began to crumble almost immediately after Amara's revelation. In the days following the confrontation, word spread like wildfire throughout the village. It wasn't just the betrayal of a wife, it was the complete unraveling of Jomo's carefully curated public image. Once seen as the ideal husband, the successful and charming man who had married into wealth and status, Jomo now found himself abandoned by his family, rejected by his peers, and shunned by the very community that had once admired him. At first, Jomo tried to salvage what little was left of his reputation. He spoke to anyone who would listen, telling his side of the story, blaming his actions on the pressures of the marriage and the expectations placed upon him. He pleaded for understanding, but the truth had already taken hold. His words fell on deaf ears, his pleas ignored. The village had seen through him, and there was no returning from the betrayal. Amara's truth had become the community's truth, and it had left an indelible mark on Jomo's name. In a final desperate attempt, Jomo sought out Amara, hoping that perhaps, with time, she would forgive him and allow him to make amends. But Amara had no intention of offering him the forgiveness he craved. She had already given him far more than he deserved, and the wounds he had inflicted on her were still too raw to be healed by empty apologies. When he approached her, words tumbling from his lips, she stood her ground, cold and resolute. "You've taken enough from me already, Jomo," Amara said, her voice steady and unwavering. "I'm done with you. You don't deserve my forgiveness, and I will never forget what you did." His face fell, but Amara didn't waver. She was done with the man who had never truly loved her, the man who had only used her to further his own goals. She walked away from him without a second glance, and in doing so, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The anger that had once burned so fiercely within her began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. She realized that forgiveness wasn't about absolving Jomo of his sins. It was about giving herself the freedom to move on. Forgiveness was a gift she would give herself, not him. As Amara moved forward, she felt the stirrings of a new sense of purpose within her. She had spent so long living for others, trying to please her family, trying to fulfill the expectations of her society, trying to win the approval of a man who would never love her. But now, she was free. She had the opportunity to live for herself, to carve out her own path, and to make a difference in the lives of others. In the months following the divorce, Amara began an advocacy project aimed at empowering young women in her village. She had always been passionate about self-love and independence, and now, with the lessons she had learned from her own experiences, she wanted to share those lessons with the younger generation. She organized workshops and talks, encouraging young girls to find their voices, to value themselves, and to never settle for a life that didn't honor their worth. Amara's message was simple but powerful. You are enough, just as you are. You deserve love, respect, and happiness, not because of who you marry, not because of the wealth or status you hold, but because you are worthy of it simply for being yourself. Her work began to inspire many, and Amara found herself becoming a source of strength and guidance for those who needed it the most. In helping others find their own empowerment, she found her own sense of purpose and fulfillment. One day, months after her divorce, Amara returned to the wedding venue. The place that had once been a symbol of her broken dreams now held a new meaning. She walked through the gates, her heart steady, her head held high. This time, she wasn't walking in with the weight of betrayal and disappointment on her shoulders. Instead, she walked in with a quiet strength, a confidence that came from within. She had faced the darkness of her past and had emerged from it stronger than ever before. Amara stood in the middle of the venue, the place where she had once pledged herself to a man who had never deserved her. Now, it was a place of empowerment, a symbol of her resilience, her growth, and her ability to rise above. The pain she had once felt here had been transformed into something beautiful, something that would never be taken from her again. With a deep breath, Amara closed her eyes and smiled. The past was behind her, but it had shaped her into the woman she was today. And as she turned to leave the venue, she knew that this was not the end of her story. It was just the beginning of the life she was meant to live. A life filled with purpose, strength, and the freedom to be her true self. In the final moments of her newfound peace, Amara received a letter that caught her completely off guard. It arrived on a quiet afternoon, an unassuming envelope with her name written in familiar handwriting, Jomo's handwriting. At first, she considered ignoring it, her heart already hardened against him. But curiosity, that nagging, unwelcome feeling, drove her to open the envelope. Inside, the letter was short, but its contents sent shockwaves through her. Jomo, in his desperate final attempt to manipulate her, had confessed something she never could have imagined. He admitted that the marriage had never been about love or even status. It had been about survival. Jomo had been drowning in debt, his financial ruin hidden behind the mask of success. He had married her not for her love, but for her wealth. The real kicker came at the end of the letter. Jomo had been using her money to pay off a loan shark, someone dangerous, someone ruthless, who had him in a chokehold, demanding constant payments. It was a secret he had buried deep, even from her, and it was only because of her wealth that he had managed to keep himself afloat. Amara, stunned at the revelation, felt the sting of betrayal all over again. But this time, there was no sadness, no regret, only a quiet sense of closure. She stared at the letter, holding it in her hands for a long time, considering what it meant. The man she had married had used her in every conceivable way, not just emotionally, but financially as well. He had never cared for her, and now, she realized, his actions had been driven by a desperation that was as selfish as it was cruel. But rather than feeling anger or resentment, Amara only felt relief. With a small smile, she ripped the letter into pieces, the paper falling like confetti in the breeze. She didn't need to read any more lies. She didn't need to be reminded of how deeply she had been deceived. The past was just that, past. Amara was better off without him. As the pieces of the letter fluttered to the ground, she took a deep breath, standing tall as she walked away from the ruins of her former life. The future stretched before her, wide open and full of possibilities. With each step, Amara embraced her independence, her growth, and the woman she had become. The final chapter was written, and she was ready to start the next one.